The email from First National Bank arrived at 9:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, congratulating me on my pre-approval for an $850,000 mortgage. My coffee went cold in my hand as I stared at the screen. I hadn't applied for any mortgage. I owned my townhouse outright. But there it was in black and white, complete with property details for a lakefront mansion in Clearwater Bay that I'd never laid eyes on. The loan officer cheerfully mentioned how excited my stepmother Diane must be about our family investment together. That's when my stomach dropped. By the time I finished unraveling her scheme, she wouldn't just lose access to my credit. She'd lose everything she'd spent 8 years carefully positioning herself to steal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Jennifer Parker, though everyone calls me Jen, and at 34, I've built a career most people in Riverside Heights would call impressive. As a commercial real estate analyst and financial consultant at Summit Financial Group, I spend my days evaluating property investments, assessing risk profiles, and advising clients on the biggest financial decisions of their lives. Numbers have always made sense to me in a way people sometimes don't. There's a clean logic to balance sheets, to debt-to-income ratios, to the mathematical certainty of compound interest. Maybe that's why I gravitated toward finance after my mother died 12 years ago, leaving me adrift in a world that suddenly felt unpredictable and cruel. My mother, Catherine, had been my anchor. A high school English teacher with a quiet strength that never needed to announce itself, she raised me alone after my biological parents divorced when I was 6. My father, Brandon, had been peripherally involved in my childhood, the kind of dad who showed up for mandatory events but never quite managed to be present even when he was in the room. After the divorce, he drifted further into his own world of middle management mediocrity and weekend golf games, content to send child support checks and birthday cards as substitutes for actual parenting. When Mom got sick, pancreatic cancer that moved through her body like wildfire, Dad suddenly reappeared with promises of support that evaporated the moment things got difficult. The hospital visits were too depressing. The medical discussions were too complicated. He had work obligations, he said. Important meetings. I was 22, still finishing my economics degree, and I handled everything alone. The doctor's appointments, the treatment decisions, the final horrible weeks in hospice where I held her hand and pretended I wasn't terrified of facing the world without her. 2 years after Mom died, Dad started dating Diane Mitchell, a woman who sold essential oils and manifested abundance and spoke in Instagram captions about living your best life. She was 44 to his 50. Blonde in that expensive way that requires constant maintenance, and possessed a charm that could convince you the sky was green if it served her purposes. I met her exactly twice before they got married in a courthouse ceremony 6 months into their relationship. Both times, she'd sized me up with the calculating gaze of an appraiser evaluating property, asking pointed questions about my career, my salary, whether I owned or rented, if I had investments. I should have recognized the reconnaissance for what it was. But I was still grieving, still finding my footing in a world without my mother's guidance, and some part of me wanted to believe Dad had found happiness. Diane brought along her son Tyler from a previous marriage, a 21-year-old with an impressive ability to fail upward. He'd been fired from 3 retail jobs, dropped out of community college twice, and was currently pursuing his passion for day trading with his mother's money, which is to say he was unemployed and living in their basement. The wedding was small, just immediate family and a handful of Diane's friends who all seemed to be involved in the same pyramid scheme selling overpriced supplements. I stood there in a dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, watching my father marry a woman he barely knew, and felt nothing but a distant sense of loss for the parent I'd needed and never quite had. Diane had smiled at me across the cake table, raised her champagne flute, and said something about how wonderful it was to finally have a daughter who'd really made something of herself. The way she emphasized really made it clear she considered Tyler's situation temporary, a minor setback before his inevitable success. That was 8 years ago, and I'd maintained exactly the relationship with them that I could tolerate. Holiday dinners where I showed up with wine and left after an appropriate interval. Birthday phone calls that lasted exactly long enough to be polite. The occasional text from Dad asking if I could recommend a financial advisor for some vague investment opportunity that never quite materialized. I'd learned early to keep them at a comfortable distance, cordial but never close, involved but never invested. My life in Riverside Heights had become exactly what I'd worked for, a carefully constructed existence built on financial stability and professional respect. I'd purchased my townhouse in the Willow Creek district 3 years ago, a modern 2-bedroom with clean lines and enormous windows that flooded the space with natural light. Every mortgage payment had been made early. Every expense tracked and categorized. By my 32nd birthday, I'd paid it off completely, a feat that my colleagues at Summit Financial celebrated with genuine admiration and perhaps a touch of envy. The townhouse wasn't flashy, but it was mine in the most complete sense of the word. No bank held the deed. No lender could foreclose. The master bedroom doubled as my personal sanctuary, decorated in soothing grays and whites with blackout curtains for the nights when work stress made sleep elusive. My home office occupied the second bedroom, walls lined with finance textbooks and framed certifications, my desk positioned to face the window where I could watch the neighborhood kids play in the small park across the street while I analyzed investment portfolios. I'd dated over the years, of course. There had been Marcus, an architect I'd met at a professional networking event, who'd grown frustrated with my refusal to merge our finances after dating for a year. Then came Kevin, a high school teacher with a gentle sense of humor who couldn't understand why I insisted on keeping my own place even after 18 months together. Most recently, there'd been Thomas, a fellow analyst who'd seemed perfect on paper until he proposed combining our assets into a joint investment portfolio as a precursor to marriage. Each relationship ended the same way, with them wanting access to something I'd built alone, unable to grasp that my independence wasn't a phase to grow out of but a fundamental part of my identity. My father had made his usual dismissive comments during last Christmas dinner after his third beer. "You're going to end up alone with nothing but spreadsheets to keep you warm," he'd said, while Diane nodded sympathetically and mentioned how women in their 30s really needed to be more flexible about what they wanted in a partner. Tyler had barely looked up from his phone, where he was apparently monitoring some cryptocurrency that was definitely going to make him rich this time, just like the last 5 coins that had crashed and burned. I'd smiled, helped clear the table, and left early claiming a morning meeting. That had been 9 months ago, and I'd successfully avoided any family gathering since. Dad called occasionally, usually when Diane prompted him to, asking vague questions about my work or mentioning that his wife had another business opportunity she wanted to discuss with me. I'd perfected the art of non-committal responses, the polite deflection, the promise to think about it that we both knew meant no. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have suspected sitting in my paid-off townhouse with my excellent credit score and my carefully maintained boundaries, was that Diane had been planning something far more ambitious than a business pitch. She'd been studying me for 8 years, cataloging my assets, my income, my professional reputation. She'd been waiting for the right moment, the perfect opportunity to leverage my success for her own gain. And in her mind, family meant having the right to exploit whatever resources were available, regardless of consent or legality. My career at Summit Financial had progressed steadily over the past decade. I'd started as a junior analyst fresh out of graduate school, spending my days running numbers and building financial models for senior partners. The work was detail-oriented and demanding, requiring the kind of analytical precision that came naturally to me. Within 3 years, I'd been promoted to senior analyst, then to associate consultant, and finally to my current position as a lead financial advisor specializing in commercial real estate investments. My clients ranged from small business owners looking to purchase their first retail location to developers planning multi-million-dollar residential projects. I evaluated properties, assessed market conditions, analyzed cash flow projections, and provided the kind of thorough due diligence that had earned me a reputation for being both brilliant and ruthlessly honest. If a deal was bad, I said so, regardless of how much the client wanted to hear otherwise. That integrity had cost me a few commissions over the years, but it had built trust that translated into referrals and long-term relationships. My salary had grown with my responsibilities, reaching 6 figures by the time I turned 30. I maxed out my retirement contributions every year, maintained an emergency fund that could cover 8 months of expenses, and invested surplus income in a diversified portfolio of index funds and municipal bonds. My credit score hovered around 782, maintained through meticulous on-time payments and careful management of my credit utilization ratio. In the world of personal finance, I was exactly the kind of client banks competed for, the kind of borrower who represented minimal risk and maximum profit. Which is precisely what made me such an attractive target. Diane understood enough about finance to know that my creditworthiness could open doors that remained locked to someone with her history of bankruptcies and defaulted loans. She couldn't qualify for a mortgage on her own, not with a credit score that barely scraped into the 400s and a trail of unpaid debts stretching back 2 decades. But if she could attach my name to an application, if she could somehow gain access to my financial identity, then suddenly an $850,000 lakefront property became possible. The morning the bank email arrived, I'd been reviewing a portfolio for the Henderson Group, a client considering a mixed-use development in the downtown district. My office at Summit Financial overlooked the river, and the September sunlight reflected off the water in a way that usually helped me think clearly through complex financial scenarios. I just finished my second coffee when my personal email chimed with the notification that would unravel everything. "Congratulations on your mortgage pre-approval," the subject line read. I frowned at the screen, certain it was spam or a phishing attempt. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I deleted dozens of fraudulent financial offers every week, scammers trying to trick people into clicking malicious links or providing personal information. But something made me open this one instead of sending it straight to trash. Maybe it was the sender address, an official domain from First National Bank of Oregon. Maybe it was the specific dollar amount mentioned in the preview text. Whatever the reason, I clicked. The email was professionally formatted with the bank's logo and standard legal disclaimers. It congratulated me on being pre-approved for an $850,000 mortgage at 4.2% interest over 30 years. The property address was listed as 2847 Crystal Lake Drive in Clearwater Bay, a neighboring community known for expensive waterfront homes and wealthy retirees. Monthly payment estimates were included, along with a cheerful note from loan officer Michael Torres expressing his excitement about helping my family with this exciting investment opportunity. My hands went cold despite the warm office. I hadn't applied for a mortgage. I hadn't even been looking at properties. The last time I'd driven through Clearwater Bay was 6 months ago when a client asked me to evaluate a commercial property near the marina, and I certainly hadn't stopped to browse residential real estate. I read the email 3 more times, searching for some explanation that made sense, some way this could be a mistake or miscommunication. Then I saw the line that made my stomach lurch. "We're so pleased to work with you and your stepmother Diane Parker on this family investment. Please contact me at your earliest convenience to schedule the final application appointment and property inspection. Your stepmother mentioned you'll be co-signing to help secure the best possible interest rate given the property value." The office suddenly felt too small, too warm. Co-signing. Diane had told a bank loan officer that I would co-sign a mortgage for a property I'd never seen, in an amount that would represent debt equal to my entire net worth. Without ever asking me, without even mentioning it in passing during one of our awkward holiday dinners. She'd simply informed a financial institution that I'd be legally responsible for an $850,000 loan as if my consent was assumed, as if my credit and income were family resources available for her use. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the property listing, my analyst brain automatically shifting into research mode even as panic clawed at my chest. The house was stunning in the photos, a sprawling contemporary design with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Crystal Lake. 4 bedrooms, 3.5 bathrooms, 3,500 square feet of luxury living space with a gourmet kitchen and private dock. The listing mentioned recent price reduction due to seller motivation, which any competent analyst recognized as a red flag. Properties didn't get reduced without reason, usually inspection issues or market problems that made buyers hesitant. I scrolled through the photos, looking for the telltale signs of trouble. There, in one image of the basement, water staining on the foundation walls. In another shot of the master bedroom, slight unevenness in the ceiling that suggested structural settling. The deck railings looked newer than the rest of the exterior, likely a quick cosmetic fix covering rot damage. This wasn't a dream home. This was a money pit dressed up with staging furniture and strategic camera angles, the kind of property that inexperienced buyers fell in love with before discovering they'd purchased years of expensive repairs. My phone was already dialing Ashley Williams, my best friend since college and one of the few people I trusted completely. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright with the enthusiasm she brought to everything. "Jen, hey, what's up? I'm literally walking into a deposition, can this wait?" "No," I said, hearing the shake in my own voice. "Ashley, I need you to clear your afternoon. Something's happened. My stepmother just tried to commit financial fraud using my identity, and I have no idea how deep this goes." The line went silent for 3 seconds. "I'm canceling the deposition," Ashley said, her lawyer voice activating instantly. "Don't touch anything, don't respond to any emails, don't call anyone else yet. I'll be at your office in 20 minutes, and we're going to document everything before we make another move." I hung up and stared at the email, reading it again with the trained eye of someone who analyzed financial documents for a living. The pre-approval was dated 5 days ago. 5 days that Diane had known about this, had been moving forward with plans involving my credit, my income, my financial future. 5 days she'd let pass without mentioning it, probably hoping to present the whole thing as a done deal, a family investment I'd be guilted into accepting because walking away would mean tanking the purchase and embarrassing everyone involved. My hands moved automatically to my computer, pulling up my credit monitoring account with the kind of muscle memory that came from checking it religiously every week. The page loaded slowly, each second stretching into eternity as I waited to see what damage had already been done. When the report finally appeared, my breath caught in my throat. There were 3 hard inquiries on my credit from the past 2 weeks. First National Bank, as expected from the email. But also Mountain Valley Credit Union and Pacific Trust Mortgage. Diane hadn't just applied for one loan. She'd been shopping around, seeing which lender would give her the best terms using my financial profile as leverage. I clicked through to the detailed report, my analyst training taking over even as fury built behind my ribs. Each inquiry had been submitted with my social security number, my employment information, my income details. Someone had provided tax returns that I'd never authorized anyone to access. Someone had forged documents claiming I was interested in purchasing investment property. The applications listed my current address, my phone number, even my work email at Summit Financial. This wasn't some clumsy attempt by an amateur. This was calculated, detailed, and disturbingly thorough. Ashley burst through my office door 18 minutes later, her briefcase already open and legal pad in hand. She'd been my roommate in graduate school, back when we were both surviving on ramen and ambition. Now she was a litigation attorney at Chen and Associates, specializing in fraud cases, and the fierce intelligence that made her terrifying in depositions was fully focused on my situation. "Talk," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Everything, from the beginning, chronologically." I walked her through the email, the credit inquiries, the property listing that screamed money pit to anyone with experience in real estate analysis. Ashley took notes in her precise handwriting, occasionally stopping me to ask clarifying questions about dates and details. When I finished, she sat back and tapped her pen against her notepad, her expression grim. "This is identity theft," she said flatly. "It doesn't matter that she's your stepmother. She used your personal information to apply for credit without your knowledge or consent. That's a federal crime under the Identity Theft and Assumption Deterrence Act. We're talking potential prison time, not just civil penalties." "My father," I started, then stopped. What was I going to say? That he'd be devastated? That family meant something? Brandon Parker had barely functioned as a father when it mattered. He certainly didn't get to claim family loyalty now that his wife had committed fraud against his daughter. "Your father chose his priorities when he married her," Ashley said, reading my hesitation with the accuracy of a decade of friendship. "And he's chosen them every day since by enabling her behavior. Jen, you need to understand something. People who commit this kind of fraud don't do it once. She's been planning this, probably for months. We need to find out what else she's done before we make any moves." She pulled out her phone and dialed a number from memory. "Maria, it's Ashley Williams. I need your help with a case. Identity theft, mortgage fraud, family connection making it complicated. Can you meet us this afternoon?" "Perfect." Bill my office for the consultation. We'll be there at 3. Maria Gonzalez, Ashley explained after hanging up, is a private investigator I use for complex fraud cases. Former FBI Financial Crimes Unit, 15 years investigating everything from wire fraud to money laundering. If there's a paper trail, she'll find it. And Jen, there's always a paper trail. The next 4 hours passed in a blur of documentation. Ashley had me print every email, screenshot every credit inquiry, download every financial statement from the past year. We created a timeline of my interactions with Diane, every holiday dinner, every phone call from my father, every text message asking about my work or my income. Patterns emerged that I'd been too close to see. The questions about my salary that I'd dismissed as small talk. The casual inquiries about whether I'd ever considered investment property. The way Diane always seemed interested in the details of my career, asking about client projects and deal structures with what I'd interpreted as polite interest. She was gathering intelligence, Ashley said, reading through my notes. Every conversation was reconnaissance. She's been building a profile of your financial life, figuring out exactly how much access she could claim and what she could get away with. This wasn't opportunistic. This was planned. At 3, we met Maria at her office in a converted warehouse near the river. She was 50-something with steel gray hair and the kind of direct gaze that probably made criminals confess just to escape the scrutiny. She listened to our summary without interrupting, her expression growing more serious as we detailed the credit inquiries and fraudulent applications. First thing, Maria said when we finished, we pull everything. Credit reports from all 3 bureaus, not just the monitoring service. I want to see every account opened in your name for the past 5 years. We check property records to see if she's tried this before with other addresses. We subpoena bank records if necessary. And we do this quietly, because the moment she knows you're onto her, she'll start covering tracks. Maria made 3 phone calls while Ashley and I sat in her office surrounded by filing cabinets and whiteboards covered in case diagrams. The first was to a contact at First National Bank, someone who owed her a favor from a previous investigation. Within an hour, we had copies of the complete mortgage application submitted in my name. The documents were stunning in their audacity. Someone had fabricated 2 years of tax returns showing me as a co-owner in a consulting business with Diane, complete with Schedule C forms reporting partnership income. There were forged pay stubs from Summit Financial inflating my salary by 40%. Bank statements that looked legitimate but showed account balances I'd never possessed. The application listed Diane as the primary borrower and me as the co-signer, our combined income supposedly sufficient to qualify for the loan despite her catastrophic credit history. There were even forged email exchanges between me and the loan officer discussing property details and closing timelines, conversations that had never happened written in a voice that almost sounded like mine. Whoever had created these documents understood enough about mortgage applications to make them convincing, at least to a loan officer who wasn't looking too closely. This is sophisticated, Maria said, studying the paperwork through reading glasses. The forgeries are good enough to pass initial screening. If you hadn't caught this before closing, you'd be legally obligated for the debt. The co-signer agreement here is binding once executed. She was maybe 2 weeks away from trapping you in an $850,000 nightmare. Ashley's jaw tightened. We need to know if she's done this to anyone else. Family members, friends, previous victims we don't know about. Maria, can you run a full background on Diane Parker? Everything, bankruptcies, civil suits, criminal history, known associates. Already on it, Maria replied, her fingers flying across her keyboard. And I'm putting surveillance on her residence starting tomorrow. I want to know who she's meeting with, where she's going, what she's planning. People this bold don't stop at one scheme. That night, I barely slept in my townhouse that suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a target. Every sound made me wonder if Diane had a key I didn't know about, if she'd somehow gained access to other parts of my life I hadn't yet discovered. At dawn, I changed all my passwords, enabled 2-factor authentication on every account, and placed fraud alerts with all 3 credit bureaus. The alerts would make it harder for anyone to open new accounts in my name, but they couldn't undo whatever damage had already been done. Maria's background check arrived 2 days later, and it was worse than I'd imagined. Diane had filed for bankruptcy twice, once in her 20s and again 8 years before marrying my father. Both times, she'd accumulated massive credit card debt and personal loans before walking away from the obligations. There were judgments against her from former business partners, women she'd convinced to invest in various multi-level marketing schemes before disappearing with their money. One lawsuit detailed how she'd forged a friend's signature on a loan application for a car, leaving the woman responsible for payments on a vehicle Diane had driven until repossession. The pattern was unmistakable. Diane identified people with resources, cultivated relationships, gained their trust, and then exploited their financial credibility for her own gain. My father wasn't her first victim, just her most successful long-term mark. Tyler, her son, appeared in several of the documents as an accomplice, helping his mother create fake business entities and forge documents. They were a team, and they'd been practicing this con for decades. But Maria's most disturbing discovery came from property records. 3 years ago, Diane had attempted to purchase a condo in Beaverton using forged documents claiming my father as a co-signer. That application had been rejected when the bank discovered discrepancies, but no charges had been filed because Dad had refused to press charges against his own wife. He'd known about her fraud, had been directly victimized by it, and had chosen to protect her anyway. I called him that evening, my hands shaking as I dialed. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice carrying the slightly defensive tone he always used when talking to me, as if expecting criticism. "Jenny, this is a surprise. How are you? Did you know," I asked without preamble, "that Diane applied for a mortgage in my name? That she forged my signature and fabricated tax documents to steal my financial identity?" Silence stretched across the line. Then, in a smaller voice, she mentioned wanting to look at properties with you. "I thought you discussed it." The lie was so transparent it would have been laughable if it weren't enraging. "Dad, there are forged documents. Fake tax returns. False income statements. She committed federal crimes using my personal information. And you knew she was capable of this because she already did it to you 3 years ago." More silence. "Finally, she's had some financial difficulties. She gets desperate sometimes. But she loves this family. She was trying to create something good for all of us. By destroying my credit and trapping me in debt? By committing fraud that could have ruined my career? That's not love, Dad. That's predatory." "You always were so rigid about these things," he said, and I heard Diane's influence in his words. "So unwilling to help family when they need it. Your mother raised you to be selfish." I hung up before I said something unforgivable. Whatever relationship I'd maintained with my father was finished. He'd chosen Diane over his daughter, chosen enabling a criminal over protecting his child, and that choice would have consequences for both of them. Ashley filed the criminal complaint the next morning. Identity theft, wire fraud, forgery, conspiracy to commit mortgage fraud. The charges were federal, carrying potential sentences of up to 30 years combined. We also filed for restraining orders against both Diane and Tyler, prohibiting them from contacting me or accessing any information about my finances. The civil lawsuit came next, seeking damages for emotional distress, credit damage, and legal fees. We sued Diane, Tyler, and my father as a co-conspirator who'd knowingly allowed the fraud to proceed. The arrest happened 3 days later. Maria's surveillance had tracked Diane to a meeting with a document forger, a man with prior convictions for creating fake financial records. They'd been discussing how to make the mortgage application even more convincing, how to fake employment verification calls from Summit Financial. Police arrested them both at a coffee shop in downtown Portland, Diane's laptop full of incriminating evidence seized on the spot. Tyler was picked up that same afternoon trying to board a flight to Cancun with $12,000 in cash. He'd apparently been planning to disappear once the mortgage closed, leaving me holding the debt while he lived on beaches with money his mother had promised him from the property flip. Instead, he spent the night in county jail, crying about how this was all a misunderstanding. The media coverage was immediate and brutal. Local news stations picked up the story of a stepmother who tried to defraud her successful stepdaughter, the family betrayal angle too compelling to resist. My phone flooded with calls from reporters wanting interviews, but Ashley had prepared me well. I gave one carefully worded statement expressing disappointment that family would exploit trust for financial gain, then referred all further questions to my attorney. What I didn't expect was the flood of messages from other women. They came through every channel, email and social media, and even letters mailed to my office. Stories of mothers who'd opened credit cards in their daughters' names, of siblings who'd forged signatures on loan documents, of family members who'd stolen identities and ruined credit scores. Each message said essentially the same thing: I thought I was alone. Thank you for fighting back. Within a week, a reporter from a financial crimes podcast contacted me about doing a series on family financial abuse. A local credit union asked if I'd speak at their fraud prevention workshop. The state attorney general's office reached out about using my case as an example in their consumer protection literature. What had started as a personal violation was becoming something larger, a conversation about financial boundaries and family exploitation that apparently struck a chord with thousands of people. The criminal trial took 8 months to reach court. Diane's attorney tried every tactic, claiming she'd misunderstood the process, that she'd thought I'd agreed verbally, that this was a family miscommunication blown out of proportion. But the evidence was overwhelming. The forged documents, the emails to the document forger, Tyler's flight attempt, the previous victims Maria had located who agreed to testify. The jury deliberated for 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Diane got 6 years in federal prison. Tyler received 3 years for conspiracy and fraud. My father was charged as an accessory for his knowing failure to report the earlier fraud attempt, receiving 2 years probation and a permanent stain on his record that would follow him into retirement. The civil judgment awarded me $300,000, though I knew I'd never collect most of it. Diane had no assets worth seizing, and Tyler had already spent whatever money he'd accumulated on failed cryptocurrency investments. But the money wasn't the point. The point was establishing consequences, creating a legal precedent that family relationship didn't excuse criminal behavior. The point was standing in that courtroom and watching Diane's face as the judge explained exactly how her entitlement and fraud had destroyed any claim to family loyalty she might once have held. I started a nonprofit 6 months after the trial concluded. The Financial Identity Protection Foundation offered free credit monitoring, legal consultations, and fraud recovery assistance to victims of family financial abuse. We partnered with banks and credit unions to develop better verification processes for loan applications. We lobbied for legislation requiring additional identity confirmation when family members were listed as co-signers or co-borrowers. Within 2 years, we'd helped over 500 people recover from similar schemes, and 3 states had passed laws directly inspired by my case. My father reached out once after his probation ended, a short email asking if we could talk. I didn't respond. Some bridges, once burned, aren't worth rebuilding. He'd made his choices repeatedly over years, and those choices had consequences that extended beyond legal penalties. I had a half-sister, Emma, who was 15 when all this happened. She'd been devastated by her mother's imprisonment, confused and angry at a world that suddenly made no sense. I reached out to her carefully, through her school counselor, offering support without demands. We met for coffee occasionally, and I helped her understand that her mother's crimes weren't her fault, that she could build a different kind of life if she chose. 5 years after that email from the bank, I stood in my townhouse kitchen, now fully renovated with marble countertops I'd chosen myself, and thought about how close I'd come to losing everything. The mortgage Diane tried to trap me in would have destroyed my credit, tanked my career, and possibly bankrupted me when the property's structural issues became undeniable. Instead, I'd fought back with documentation and legal strategy, refusing to accept that family meant permission to exploit. My phone buzzed with a message from Maria. Another case, another woman whose brother had tried to use her identity for a business loan. Would I be willing to consult, to share what I'd learned? I smiled and typed yes. Because that was the thing about surviving fraud, about refusing to be a victim. Once you understood the patterns, once you'd built the systems to fight back, you had a responsibility to help others do the same. Diane had tried to steal my financial future. Instead, she'd created an advocate who would spend years ensuring other families understood that love and trust didn't mean surrendering your identity or accepting abuse. The foundation thrived. The legislation passed. And every time I checked my credit report, seeing it pristine and protected, I remembered that boundaries weren't selfish. They were survival. And family that couldn't respect them wasn't really family at all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.